The Walmart stood alone at the edge of town, its parking lot an empty sea of cracked asphalt. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, spilling their cold glow into the night. I parked my beat-up Camry under the lone security light, feeling both grateful and miserable. Grateful because this was my last chance at steady work. Miserable because, well, it was a night shift as a Walmart security guard. It's not much, but it'll pay the bills, I muttered, stepping out into the cool air. My breath fogged briefly before disappearing. Rick, the store manager, was waiting just inside the automatic doors. A weary man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl. He looked like he'd been pulled out of bed against his will. "You're Greg?" he asked, not offering a handshake. "That's me," I replied, forcing a smile. He didn't return it. "All right. Follow me. I'll show you the ropes." The store was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the freezers in the back. Even during the day, I doubted this place saw much action. It was too far from the interstate, too close to the middle of nowhere. Rick led me to the tiny security office near the loading docks. It was barely more than a closet with a desk, a chair, and a wall of monitors showing grainy black and white footage of the store. He gestured for me to sit while he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "These are the rules," he said, handing it to me. "Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine." I raised an eyebrow. "Rules? For a Walmart?" Rick's gaze sharpened. "Just read them, okay? And don't ask questions. You want this job or not?" I nodded and unfolded the paper. The rules were handwritten in neat, blocky letters. Never enter aisle 12 after midnight. If you hear a noise in the electronics section, ignore it. If a customer appears after closing hours, call me immediately. Do not engage. At 3:33 a.m., check the freezer aisle. If the door is open, close it. Quickly. Don't look at the ceiling after a.m., I chuckled nervously. "Is this a joke?" Rick didn't smile. "It's not. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine. Break them, and, well, you won't want to find out." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "What happens if just do the job?" he snapped. Then, softening slightly, he added, "Look, the pay's decent, and we don't ask for much. But those rules, they're non-negotiable. Got it?" I nodded, unsure whether to feel creeped out or just annoyed. Rick left me alone after that. I spent the first hour wandering the aisles, getting a feel for the place. It was like any other Walmart rows of cheap plastic junk, shelves stocked with too much cereal, and a faint smell of cleaning chemicals. At 11:45, I returned to the security office and started watching the monitors. Nothing unusual, just endless static Y footage of empty aisles. Then, at exactly midnight, the screen showing aisle 12 flickered. I leaned closer, squinting at the grainy image. For a second, just a second, I thought I saw something move. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes. "Get a grip, Greg. It's just bad reception." Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. At 12:30, I heard a faint noise coming from the electronics section. A soft thunk, like something falling. My first instinct was to check it out, but then I remembered the second rule. If you hear a noise in the electronics section, ignore it. "All right," I muttered, leaning back in the chair. Ignoring it, the noise came again. Louder this time. My fingers hovered over the phone. Maybe I should call Rick, just to be safe. But then I imagined his scowl, his condescending tone. "It's probably just a rat," I told myself. Nothing to freak out about. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. At 3:33, I checked the freezer aisle as instructed. The doors were all closed, and I felt a small sense of relief. By the time AM rolled around, I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended. But as I was about to pack up, I caught something on the monitors. A figure. It was faint, barely more than a shadow, standing at the far end of aisle 12. My heart thumped painfully in my chest. "Nope," I whispered, tearing my eyes away from the screen. "Not my problem." When I looked back, the shadow was gone. The rest of the shift was a blur of adrenaline and dread. As soon as Rick showed up to relieve me, I handed him the keys and practically ran to my car. I didn't tell him about the shadow. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy. Or maybe, deep down, I didn't want to know what he'd say. As I drove home, the list of rules sat heavy in my mind. I told myself it was just another weird quirk of a dead-end job. Nothing to worry about. But as I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I pulled into the parking lot for my second shift, I wasn't sure if I was more nervous or just exhausted. The list of rules replayed in my head like a broken record, but I kept telling myself it was just a bunch of nonsense. Rick was probably testing me, seeing how gullible I was. The night air was cooler than before, and the Walmart loomed like a tombstone against the moonlit sky. As I stepped inside, the automatic doors groaned as if reluctant to let me in. I found Rick in the break room, pouring coffee into a stained mug. "How was your first night?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Uneventful," I lied. "Good," he nodded, taking a sip. "Keep it that way." Before I could press him for more, he waved me off and left, disappearing into the manager's office. By midnight, I was back in the security office, glued to the monitors. The grainy footage flickered occasionally, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that shadow from the night before. At 12:15, I forced myself to do a walkthrough of the store. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of the freezers. Aisle 12 looked normal, just rows of cleaning supplies and cheap plastic bins. I stared down the aisle for a long moment, half expecting something to materialize. But it was empty. "See? Nothing to worry about," I muttered, my voice echoing faintly. I was halfway back to the security office when the overhead lights flickered. I froze. It was subtle, just a brief stutter, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. Then came the noise of soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from aisle 12. I told myself to ignore it, to go back to the office and follow the rules. But my feet didn't listen. The tapping grew louder as I approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I turned the corner into aisle 12, the sound had stopped. The aisle was empty. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. But then I saw it, a single bottle of bleach lying in the middle of the floor, its cap rolling lazily in a circle. A cold chill ran down my spine. I crouched to pick up the bottle, glancing up at the shelves as if expecting someone or something to be there. Nothing. I set the bottle back on the shelf and turned to leave, but then I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't on the wall or the floor. It was in the air, faint but unmistakable, hovering at the far end of the aisle. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow didn't move, didn't shift. It just existed like a smudge on reality. "Hello," my voice cracked, and I hated myself for speaking. The shadow stretched, elongating unnaturally, as if reacting to my voice. That was enough for me. I turned and walked ran back to the security office, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I stared at the monitors. The camera for aisle 12 was flickering again, the static worse than before. For the rest of the night, I didn't leave the office. At 3:33, I forced myself to check the freezer aisle. The doors were all closed, but my reflection in the glass looked distorted, stretched in ways that didn't make sense. By a.m., I was counting the minutes, my eyes darting to the ceiling despite myself. Nothing happened, but the tension in the air was suffocating. When Rick showed up to relieve me, I didn't mention the shadow or the bleach. I just handed him the keys and bolted for my car. At home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, felt its unnatural presence. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, my imagination running wild after too many hours alone in a giant, empty store. But deep down, I knew better. The next evening, as I prepared for my shift, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Rick. "Stick to the rules tonight. Especially Rule 1. See you at 6. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to go back, but I needed the paycheck. So I grabbed my coat and headed out, dreading what the night would bring. By my third shift, I decided to take the rules seriously, no matter how absurd they seemed. Ignoring that shadow, whatever it was, had probably saved me, and I wasn't eager to push my luck. The store felt different that night, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The air seemed heavier, the aisles darker, despite the fluorescent lights. My footsteps echoed louder than usual, each step feeling like a reminder of how alone I was. I started my rounds at midnight. Aisle 12 was first, not because I wanted to go there, but because I needed to get it over with. I peeked around the corner cautiously, holding my flashlight like a weapon. The aisle was empty, just rows of Windex and mops. I let out a shaky breath and moved on. At 12:45, the sound started. A soft shuffle, like footsteps, coming from the electronics section. My first instinct was to investigate after all. It was my job to make sure no one was sneaking around. But then I remembered Rule 2. If you hear a noise in the electronics section, ignore it. I sat in the security office, staring at the monitor that showed the electronics aisle. The feed was clear, no flickering or static, but it was also empty. The sound came again, louder this time, like something being dragged across the floor. "Stay put," I muttered to myself, gripping the edge of the desk. And then I saw him. The man appeared on the screen without warning, standing at the far end of the electronics aisle. He was tall, wearing a long coat that looked out of place for the season. His face was turned away from the camera, but something about his posture made my skin crawl. I grabbed the phone to call Rick, but before I could dial, the man moved. He didn't walk or run, he just wasn't there anymore. I stared at the monitor, my heart pounding. The aisle was empty again, as if he'd never been there. I set the phone down, trying to convince myself it was a glitch. At 1:30, I heard the sound again, this time closer. I froze, my ears straining. It wasn't coming from the electronics section anymore, it was in the main aisle, just outside the security office. "Don't open the door," I whispered to myself, as if saying it out loud would make it easier to obey. The shuffling stopped, replaced by a soft tapping on the door. My blood turned to ice. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I forced myself to look at the monitors, but the feed from the camera outside the office was flickering, the static too thick to see anything. "Greg," a voice called softly. I almost screamed. It was a man's voice, low and gravelly, but there was something off about it. It sounded too smooth, like someone imitating speech rather than speaking naturally. "Greg," it said again. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to respond. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the voice spoke again, this time from farther away. "Rule 3, Greg. Don't engage," my breath caught. "Whoever or whatever it was, they knew the rules. The rest of the shift was a blur of panic and paranoia. I didn't leave the office, didn't even look at the monitors after that. When Rick showed up at AM, I didn't say a word. "You look like hell," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Rough night," I replied. Rick didn't press, but as I handed him the keys, he said something that made my stomach drop. "Be careful tonight. Fridays are unpredictable." By the time my fourth shift rolled around, I was starting to feel the weight of the job, literally. My chest felt tight as I walked into the store that night, like the air itself was warning me to turn around. Rick was waiting for me in the break room. He didn't smile, didn't ask how I was holding up. Instead, he handed me a fresh list of rules. "Updates," he said gruffly. I scanned the new list, my heart sinking as I read Rule 5. "Do not go into aisle 9 after 3 o'clock a.m. "Why?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Rick didn't answer. He just gave me a long look, the kind that made me feel like I was already in over my head, and walked off. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I stuck to the security office, watching the monitors and jotting down notes for my rounds. The aisles looked normal, the cameras steady. At 1:30 a.m., I started my walkthrough. I kept my pace brisk, my flashlight cutting through the dim glow of the overhead lights. Aisle 9 was on the far side of the store, right between the cereal and the canned goods. As I passed it, I hesitated, my eyes drawn to the neatly arranged shelves. Something about the aisle felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, no shadows, no flickering lights, but the air felt heavier, thicker. I shivered and moved on, telling myself it was just nerves. By 2:45, I was back in the security office, staring at the monitors. I kept glancing at the clock, the minutes dragging as 3 o'clock a.m. crept closer. At 2:59, the feed for aisle 9 flickered. I leaned forward, my stomach twisting. The camera stabilized, but the aisle was no longer empty. There was a figure standing at the far end, its back turned to the camera. It was tall and thin, its outline almost humanoid, but something was off. The proportions weren't right, its arms too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My first instinct was to grab the walkie-talkie and call Rick, but I stopped myself. Rule 5. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the camera. It just stood there, as still as the shelves around it. I forced myself to look away, my hands gripping the desk. I stared at the clock instead, counting the seconds until 3:01. When I finally looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. At 3:15, I heard the sound of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, echoing down the main aisle. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding as the steps grew louder. They stopped just outside the security office. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then came the voice. "Greg," it said, low and drawn out, almost a growl. It wasn't the same voice I'd heard the night before. This one was deeper, more guttural, and it made my skin crawl. I kept my eyes on the monitors, but the camera outside the office was static again. The voice called my name twice more, each time softer, almost teasing. At 3:30, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. When my shift finally ended, I didn't wait for Rick. I tossed the keys onto the desk and bolted for the parking lot. The ride home was a blur, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The figure in aisle 9, the voice outside the office, the rules. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made a decision. I was going to quit. Whatever was happening at that Walmart, I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. When I woke up the next afternoon, quitting didn't feel like an option anymore. Not because I'd changed my mind, but because my phone had 2 missed calls from Rick. The voicemail he left was short and to the point. "Don't even think about bailing on me, Greg. You're on the schedule tonight." I thought about ignoring him, but something in his tone stopped me. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was desperation. So, like a sucker, I showed up for my shift. Rick was waiting for me outside the break room, his expression darker than usual. He handed me the keys without a word, then pulled a small, laminated card from his pocket. "Keep this with you," he said, thrusting it into my hand. The card was white with bold black lettering. "Rule 6. If something whispers your name, run." I stared at it, then back at Rick. "What the hell does this mean?" "It means what it says," he replied. "And it's not a suggestion." Before I could press him for more, he walked away, leaving me alone with the growing pit in my stomach. The store felt wrong that night, worse than it ever had before. The aisles were darker, the lights above flickering just enough to be noticeable. The air smelled stale, like something old and rotting. By midnight, I was already on edge. Every creak of the building made me flinch. Every flicker of the monitors sent my heart racing. At 1:00 a.m., I heard the first whisper. "Greg." It was faint, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. I froze in place, my hand tightening around my flashlight. The sound had come from aisle 6, the one with all the cleaning supplies. I remembered Rule 6 and stayed put, telling myself I was safe in the security office. But then it came again, louder this time. "Craig." It was soft, almost gentle, like someone trying to coax me out of hiding. The monitors for aisle 6 were static, of course. The rules didn't make room for curiosity or bravery, so I stayed where I was. "Greg." The whisper came again, closer now. My pulse raced as I grabbed the laminated card, clutching it like a talisman. "Run," it said. I bolted from the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran blindly, my footsteps echoing through the empty store. The aisles blurred together, the fluorescent lights above casting long, eerie shadows. The whisper followed me. "Greg." It was louder now, more insistent, but still soft enough to be unnerving. I ducked into aisle 3, pressing my back against the shelves and holding my breath. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam dancing across cans of soup and boxes of crackers. The whisper came again, closer than ever. "Greg." It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence. I could feel it, something cold and heavy, pressing against the air around me. I thought about running again, but my legs felt like lead. "Greg." This time, it came from right behind me. I spun around, swinging the flashlight like a weapon. The beam illuminated nothing but empty air. My chest heaved as I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around the aisle. The whisper was gone, but the feeling lingered, like a shadow just out of reach. I didn't stop running until I reached the break room. The door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. The laminated card was still in my hand, the edges crumpled from how tightly I'd been gripping it. For the first time since I started this job, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't care if it made me look weak. I was done pretending I could handle this. I was done with the rules, done with the whispers, done with the shadows and the things they didn't warn me about. I was going to quit. This time, for real. The following afternoon, I arrived at the store hours before my shift, my resignation letter folded neatly in my pocket. This time, there would be no last-minute changes of heart, no second guessing. Rick was already there, sitting at the table in the break room with a cup of black coffee. He looked up as I walked in, his face tired and drawn. "I'm done," I said, placing the letter in front of him. "I'm not coming back." Rick didn't touch the letter. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You saw it, didn't you?" "Saw what?" I shot back, anger creeping into my voice. The shadows, the whispers, or the thing in aisle 9? Take your pick. Rick sighed, rubbing his temples. I was hoping you wouldn't have to deal with it this soon. Usually takes longer for the activity to start up. What is it, Rick? What's going on in this place? For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he stood, pacing the small room like a man with too many thoughts to sort out. This store, he began, his voice low, wasn't built like the others. The company bought the land cheap, but they didn't ask why it was so cheap. Turns out, it used to be. Something else, I frowned. Something else? Like what? Rick stopped pacing, his eyes meeting mine. There was a warehouse here in the 70s. They ran experiments government funded, if the rumors are true. Things went south, and the place burned down. No one talks about it now, but the ground. It remembers, I echoed, my disbelief obvious. Rick nodded. The rules are the only thing keeping us safe. They're not just random, they were written by the people who worked here before us. They learned the hard way what happens when you break them. I wanted to laugh, to call him crazy, but the memory of the whisper in aisle 6 was too fresh. What happens if you don't follow them? I asked, my voice quieter now. Rick didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was grim. People disappear. Or worse, I stayed, against my better judgment, for one last shift. Rick's words haunted me as I walked the aisles that night, flashlight in hand. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. By 2:00 a.m., I was back in the security office, staring at the monitors. The feed for aisle 9 was clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. At 2:30, the static started. It began on aisle 4, just a faint flicker, but soon spread to aisles 6, 7, and 8. By 2:45, the entire system was down, every monitor showing nothing but snow. I grabbed the laminated card Rick had given me, clutching it like a lifeline. Rule 6, if something whispers your name, run. The first whisper came at 2:59. Craig. I bolted from the office without hesitation, the card clenched in my fist. This time, I didn't stop running. I ignored the aisles, the whispers, the flickering lights. I sprinted for the exit, my breath ragged, my legs burning. When I burst through the automatic doors, the cool night air hit me like a slap. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the store. Through the glass doors, I saw Rick standing at the edge of aisle 9. He wasn't alone. A figure loomed behind him, its form too distorted to be human. For a moment, I thought Rick was smiling. Then the lights flickered, and they were both gone. I didn't go back to the Walmart the next night, or the night after that. I told myself I was done. Done with the rules, the whispers, the shadows in aisle 9. Done with Rick and his cryptic warnings. Done pretending I could handle this. But done is a funny thing. You can tell yourself you're finished, that you've moved on, but some things don't let go that easily. 3 days after I quit, I started seeing it. The first time was in the parking lot of a grocery store. I was loading my trunk with bags when I felt it like a weight pressing down on the back of my neck. I turned, and there it was. A figure standing by the carts, too far to make out details, but unmistakable in its presence. I blinked, and it was gone. The second time, I was in my apartment. I'd just gotten out of the shower when I saw it in the bathroom mirror, a shadow in the corner of the room, shifting and twisting like smoke. It didn't move closer. It didn't need to. I knew it was watching me. By the end of the week, I wasn't sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. Greg, The whisper was faint, almost tender, but it clawed at my mind like nails on a chalkboard. I started leaving the lights on, as if that would help. It didn't. The thing in the shadows didn't care about lights. It didn't care about walls, or locked doors, or the pathetic little prayers I muttered under my breath. It was always there. On the 7th night, I gave up pretending I could run from it. I packed a bag, just the essentials, and drove back to the Walmart. The parking lot was empty, the store dark except for the faint glow of the emergency lights inside. I hesitated at the doors, my hand hovering over the handle. Part of me wanted to turn back, to drive as far away as I could. But the other part, the part that had been living in fear for the past week, knew there was no escape. I stepped inside. The store felt dead. The hum of the fluorescents was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I made my way to the break room, the laminated rules card clenched in my hand. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows darker. When I reached the break room, Rick was waiting for me. He looked worse than before, pale, gaunt, his eyes ringed with shadows. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice flat. "You didn't give me a choice," I shot back. Rick didn't argue. He just gestured for me to sit. "You're marked now," he said, his tone matter of fact. "It happens to everyone who breaks the rules. I didn't break any rules." I snapped. Rick raised an eyebrow. "You quit. That's breaking the biggest rule of all." I wanted to argue, to yell, to demand answers, but the look in Rick's eyes stopped me. "Can it be undone?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Rick hesitated, then nodded. "There's a way. But it's not easy. Tell me," I said, leaning forward. "You have to go to aisle 9, he said. "Alone. And you have to face it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I thought about the thing I'd seen behind Rick that night, the twisted, shifting form that wasn't quite human. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Rick didn't respond. He didn't need to. The store stretched before me, dark and silent. The glow of the emergency lights barely reached the aisles, leaving most of the space shrouded in shadows. Rick stayed behind in the break room. He didn't wish me luck, didn't tell me what to expect. He just handed me a flashlight that barely worked and a small pocket knife that felt more like a cruel joke than a real defense. "Aisle 9, I muttered to myself, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The journey there felt endless. Every creak of the floor, every distant hum of the cooling systems set my nerves on edge. The rules card was still in my pocket, though I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. Whatever was coming for me didn't seem like the kind of thing that followed rules. As I turned the corner into aisle 9, I stopped dead in my tracks. The air was colder here, biting and sharp, and there was a smell metallic, like blood and rust. The shelves were wrong too, leaning at odd angles as if the space itself had started to twist. And at the end of the aisle, it waited. It wasn't a shadow this time. It had form now, though nothing about it was natural. Its shape was human, almost a tall figure wrapped in darkness that writhed and pulsed like it was alive. Where a face should have been, there was only emptiness, a void that seemed to pull the air from my lungs. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Greg," the whisper came from everywhere and nowhere, low and resonant, vibrating through my chest. I wanted to run, to turn back and leave this cursed place forever. But Rick's words echoed in my mind. "You have to face it." The thing moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. "Why me?" I choked out, my voice barely audible. The thing tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then it spoke again, and this time, the voice was my own. "You invited me in." I staggered back, my head spinning. What? What are you? I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. I am what you fear, it replied, its voice shifting, morphing into my mother's, my father's, my own again. I am the weight you carry, the choices you regret, the truths you deny. It took another step forward, and the aisle seemed to shrink around me. I gripped the knife tighter, though it felt like a child's toy in my hand. What do you want from me? The thing stopped, its void-like face inches from mine. I don't want anything. You called me. You need me. My breath came in shallow gasps. I don't need you. I never wanted this. The thing laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made my skin crawl. You followed the rules, but you never asked why they existed. You obeyed, but you never understood. This place doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. I don't know what came over me then, fear, desperation, or sheer stupidity. But I lunged forward, the knife aimed at the center of its chest. The blade hit nothing. The figure dissolved into shadows swirling around me, pulling me under. My flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam flickering out. The darkness was complete, suffocating. And then I was falling. I woke up in my car. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. My head ached, and my clothes were damp with sweat. For a moment, I thought it had been a dream. Then I looked at the passenger seat. The knife was there, its blade coated in something black and oily. Next to it was the rules card, now blank. I quit that day, for real this time. No resignation letter, no notice. I just drove away and never looked back. The thing in aisle 9 hasn't followed me, not yet anyway. But sometimes late at night, I hear it. A whisper in the dark. Craig.